Okay, folks, we're going to do chapter 6 notes. In your Nature Unbound book, it's exploring the nature of energy flow. So we have to have a little bit of review about energy. Understand energy is the ability to do work. Energy is something that creates change. So, for instance, it takes energy to do things, such like moving your car from standing still to moving, heating your stove up from cold to hot, also your classroom from dark to bright. The kinetic energy and potential energy, again, the difference, kinetic energy being energy in motion. There's some examples there for you. Me talking right now, moving particles with my vocal cords. Light moves in waves, so sunlight is technically kinetic energy. Heat, electricity is all movement of objects. Are some other examples of kinetic energy. Potential energy is that stored energy. When we talk about it in this case, we're talking about chemical energy stored in molecules, such as carbohydrates, fats, lipids, proteins. It's all potential energy that can help us move and do work. The image to the left here is water behind a dam. That's a great example of some potential energy. And then when you stretch a rubber band out, that gives you that elastic potential energy. Understand the total amount of energy in the universe is constant, so it can't be created or destroyed. It changes one form into another, though. All organisms, everything an organism does requires energy, from growing new cells, maintaining body temperature, pumping blood through the body, moving, escaping from predators, all require some form of energy. So how do we obtain that energy, or how do we produce it? So photosynthesis being the process by which producers, not only plants, but some photosynthetic beings also will take carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight and actually turn them into glucose and oxygen. During photosynthesis, these photosynthetic organisms will harness the energy provided by the sun and transform it into the glucose and also oxygen as it releases the oxygen to us to breathe. Sometimes we think about, and this is the thing about it is how the energy stays constant, is not all energy is absorbed here on Earth. Some is obviously reflected back into the atmosphere. Some parts are transformed into heat. And then the last type of energy that we like to talk about in the form of sugars, that glucose, okay, it is stored in those chemical bonds. When we talk about all this, we're really talking about a broad topic called primary production. It's the process and resulting tissue of plant and other photosynthetic organisms formed when they combine glucose with other molecules. It helps with cellular respiration that glucose does. We take it in, we eat it, we break it down to the glucose level. We use oxygen in most cases through aerobic respiration to get the most bang for our buck. Called ATP, which is aminotriphosphate. So we take that glucose and we change the molecular formation of it and create ATP. So at the cellular level, we can go through different processes. So we give these photosynthetic organisms a name. We call them producers because they produce their own food. They produce their own energy by the use of sunlight. So they harness that sunlight, bring in carbon dioxide and water, and they'll change it into glucose for their use and for others' uses. So primary production is affected by a couple different things. Three things that we're going to talk about: temperature, moisture, and nutrients. It's also measured in various ways. One way that we like to measure is mass per unit of time. So when you look at this image right here, you see net primary production, grams per square meter per year. And what you're looking at is primary production based off of different areas or different types of ecosystems. So when we look at it, obviously light is a very important part of primary production, because without it, photosynthesis cannot occur. So, for example, right here, this paragraph here talks about the difference between middle of the ocean, where there's low primary production, because the deeper you go in the ocean, less light gets to those areas for photosynthesis to take place. Same thing with the poles. They get low primary production because they don't get that much daylight. But in contrast, when you look at the equator and a lot of our areas that are, you know, kind of in that equator belt, you see a lot of high primary production areas, okay, because they get a lot of light. Temperature is also very important. Photosynthesis is definitely influenced by temperature. It tends to be slower when it's colder. It increases as the temperature goes up. Think about that. Spring, right after winter, we get kind of an influx of growth of plants and producers really producing a lot as it warms up. Then at a certain point, it starts to slow down once it gets really hot, though. Because carbon dioxide is found in very good supply everywhere, it really doesn't hinder any kind of area in primary production. Water does, though, because, for example, in deserts, tundras, and prairies, you could go days without seeing water. So water can be a very limiting factor in primary production, whereas carbon dioxide really is not an issue. Food chains are the next thing, show a specific pathway of energy flow in a community. Energy flow is that transfer of energy from one organism to another. So how do we move the energy and transform it for the needs of the next organism, basically, is what we're looking at. Again, producers are that specialized brand of organism that can take sunlight, convert it into a form of energy that most organisms will use, that glucose, and that's where the energy flow begins. From a producer, we go to consumers. Consumers do not have the ability to create their own food, so they must consume energy. We have three different types. We have herbivores, carnivores, omnivores right here. Herbivores eat plants and other producers only. Carnivores are going to eat consumers only, so they're going to eat meat only. And omnivores eat both producers and consumers, so they'll eat plants and animals. When we look at food chains, they're very simple to understand. It just shows how energy is transferred from producer to consumer to the next consumer throughout a pathway. So each food chain shows a very specific pathway that energy takes from the sun, gets transformed into that glucose stored within the molecules within the cells that are being consumed by consumers and so forth, passed on. The next step, though, is a food web, and they become very complex illustrations of interconnected food chains. So a food web is a complex illustration that shows all the possible pathways energy could take. Could be a lot of different ways. If this organism eats this organism, what happens if this organism's taken out? Different things, but it becomes a very complex graphic to be looking at. And we also add detrivorts and decomposers. Detrivorts and decomposers are both organisms that feed on dead or decaying organisms. The big difference is that detrivorts are going to just feed on them and break down dead organisms into smaller pieces, whereas decomposers will take the larger molecules found in the tissue of organisms and break it down into smaller molecules yet. Just a second, folks. Okay. Some species affect the food web more than others. When we look at it the same way, right here's an example that dandelions can take over spring lawn, you know, a lot of people that take good care of their lawn wants green grass, no dandelions. Cattails are the same thing. If we look in a marsh or a shallow marsh, they can take over and outcompete a lot of the plants for sunlight, space, and nutrients. When that happens, you're going to lose a lot of shelter and possibly food for other organisms. So a greater diversity of herbivores leads to a greater diversity of carnivores. When we talk about a keystone species, that's a species, even though it could be in low abundance, has a dramatic effect on a community. They are not the dominant species. Going back to the example, we have the dominant species of cattails or phytoplankton. If we had that species, a keystone species in that area that could help to kind of keep those in check, would be a muskrat. So the muskrat would actually break down some of the cattails, keep them in check, so to say, so that other herbivores could also be safe there, and also other producers could have areas to grow there too. Here's another example: the white-tailed deer population, if it got too large, could strip the vegetation from an area. That's why it's so important that we, through conservation efforts, try to keep that population down, because the natural predators, the mountain lions and wolves, are kind of out of the picture. So we hunt throughout the year, all right, during different times that the conservation deems necessary, and we keep the population in check. The next thing is energy pyramids. Basically what they can do is they can simplify a food web down by putting them in trophic levels, which is a position an organism occupies in a food chain. First trophic level contains all your plants, phytoplankton, and other organisms that are photosynthetic. They're going to take the sunlight again and create that chemical energy for themselves. They're producers, so they are that baseline. Then we have the second trophic level, which we call primary consumers. They're what we would consider an herbivore, so they're going to eat the primary producers. The third trophic level is a secondary consumer. They're going to eat the primary consumers. So they tend to be omnivores or carnivores, and they're going to eat the level below them. So they're going to eat the herbivores. The fourth trophic level is the tertiary consumer, and they are going to eat the secondary consumers, tend to be only carnivores at the next two levels, the fourth and fifth trophic level. The fifth trophic level being that quaternary consumer. We would be considered in that, or top humans would be considered to be a quaternary consumer in most cases, or what we would like to call a top level carnivore. Now, obviously, most humans are going to be an omnivore in most cases. As you look at this, I'm going to zoom out here. As you look at this pyramid, you can see that the base is the biggest, okay? And as we move up an energy pyramid, the big thing that we need to understand is there is a big area of producers, because it's got to support the next level up. As you move up that triangle, as we move from down here to producer level all the way up to the quaternary level, you see less individuals in each level. So with the less, or not less, but not as many areas of competition, it's because there's energy loss from the pyramid. Not energy loss, because remember, we can't create or destroy energy. It just gets transferred out of the pyramid. So as we move up, the available energy at each trophic level goes down. That energy available in sunlight is about 15% is reflected back into the atmosphere. Only about 40% is converted to where, or 40% is converted to heat, and 40% is used to pull water from the ground through the roots and leaves. So that leaves about 5% for photosynthesis. And the plant uses that portion of the energy to convert the photosynthesis during cellular respiration, and the processes that keep the cell alive. So the rest of the energy, only about 1%, is stored in the cells that we as consumers will take in. Now, the primary consumers eat those plants. They're going to gain some energy. But again, not all that plant is easily digested. So we have cellulose, lignin, some other tissue that passes straight through the primary consumer's digestive tract without any kind of energy absorption. So that would get put back into the detrivorous and decomposer area. They take that waste and they're going to put it back into the system. So of the plant's tissue digested mainly by the primary consumer, a large part of it is used in cellular respiration to provide energy for the primary consumer to stay alive. These processes produce heat, which escapes into the air or water, wherever they're at. The rest of the energy in the plant's tissue is used to form new cells, which increases the size of the primary consumer, or are used to produce offspring. So the small fraction, only about 5 to 20% of the original energy in the plant's tissue becomes available to the secondary consumer who is eating the primary consumer. It's a very vicious cycle, and that's why you see that natural pyramid shape is because it explains why food chains have 5 or fewer links, because as time goes on, there's just less energy available. So at each level, trophic, 80 to 95% of the energy contained in the trophic level immediately is lost due to the inability to digest certain tissues from organisms. In a lower trophic level, the use of energy to keep organisms alive, or the loss of energy as heat transferred to the environment. So what we have to understand is, as we move through this pyramid, okay, we go back to here, that's why you get this pyramid shape, because there's just less energy to go around. So what you have to do is you have to compete. And when we look at these different organisms and how they compete, they'll either find a different thing to eat, or again, like we've talked about in the last chapter, they'll go become endangered and then finally become extinct. So hopefully this gives you a good understanding of the chapter 6. We will continue to look at this and have a couple projects on here. So hopefully you get a good understanding of food webs, food chains, and how energy goes through the system.